The morning starts like any other for Junwoo, except he decides responsibility can wait. School feels pointless, errands feel annoying, and all he really wants is another uninterrupted gaming session. Ignoring the note his mother left asking him to buy groceries, he settles in front of his computer, laughing and competing online with friends, completely unaware that normal life is about to disappear. Mid-game, panic suddenly breaks through the chatter. One of his friends urgently tells everyone to check the news. Jun switches on the television just in time to see a confused reporter struggling to continue a broadcast before the signal abruptly dies. His phone shows no reception. Outside his apartment window, chaos replaces the familiar rhythm of the city. People sprint through the streets, screaming, colliding, attacking one another without reason. Then he witnesses something impossible, a young woman violently biting another person. At first, Jun refuses to believe what he's seeing. Maybe it's riots, maybe some kind of accident, but the sounds echoing through his apartment building say otherwise. Heavy footsteps, distant cries, something pounding against walls. A terrified neighbor suddenly forces his way inside, desperate for shelter. The man rambles about people changing, attacking their own families. June hesitates, uncomfortable and suspicious, but reluctantly allows him to use the bathroom. Moments later, emergency broadcasts return, confirming the nightmare. A rapidly spreading infection is turning people into violent, uncontrollable attackers. Anyone bitten becomes one of them. The realization hits Jun at the same time the bathroom door opens. His neighbor emerges trembling, blood staining his neck. Within seconds, the symptoms worsen, eyes bleeding, body convulsing, bones twisting unnaturally. Panic erupts. June barely manages to force the transforming man back into the hallway before the creature fully loses control. He slams the door shut just as another monstrous figure appears outside, devouring the fallen body. Silence becomes survival. Shaking, June barricades the entrance with furniture, trying to convince himself this can't be real. Messages barely push through the failing network until one finally arrives from his sister. She tells him their family is safe for now and warns him never to open the door. Ration food. Stay hidden. Wait. Only then does June realize how badly he messed up. The groceries he ignored would have meant days, maybe weeks of survival. Time begins to blur. News reports grow worse each morning. Entire cities collapse into disorder while authorities urge everyone to remain indoors. Inspired by desperate survivors posting their locations online, Jun uploads his own plea for rescue. Hope flickers briefly when he experiments with a drone, sending his phone skyward in search of signal. But just as a call nearly connects, the battery dies, sending his last lifeline crashing to the streets below. Isolation settles in like a weight pressing on his chest. One night, gunfire cracks through the darkness. From his window, June watches a police officer fighting alone against an overwhelming crowd of infected. She struggles desperately before disappearing beneath the swarm. The abandoned weapon she leaves behind becomes an obsession protection he desperately lacks. But survival inside the apartment grows harder. A sudden attack breaches his barricade, forcing June into a risky escape onto the balcony. Hanging from the edge, he tricks a pursuing zombie into falling to its death. The victory is small, temporary. Soon after, his remaining food is ruined during the chaos. Days stretch into weeks. Hunger gnaws at him. Water runs out. The television repeats the same warnings with no solutions. Loneliness begins to fracture his sanity. He drinks the last alcohol left by his late father, dancing aimlessly just to feel something. Hallucinations blur reality. He imagines his family returning home, only to collapse when the illusion fades. Then comes the call that breaks him completely. A weak signal finally connects him to his mother, but instead of relief, he hears terror shouting, crashing sounds, and screams before the line cuts off forever. Rage and grief explode inside him. Jun storms outside in reckless despair, shouting into a city ruled by monsters, nearly sacrificing himself before barely escaping back into hiding. 20 days pass. Power fails. Darkness consumes the building. With nothing left, no food, no hope, Jun prepares to end his life. As consciousness begins slipping away, a sudden red light flashes across his vision. Across the street, someone is signaling him, a woman. Using handwritten signs and careful gestures, she silently stops him. Her name is Kim, another survivor watching from a neighboring apartment. They communicate without speaking, learning quickly that even small noises attract danger. For the first time since the outbreak began, June smiles. Someone else made it. Kim proves far more prepared than he is. Her home fortified, traps carefully placed, supplies rationed. Their daily meetings at the window become routine, a fragile connection holding them both together. When rain falls, they collect water like treasure. Seeing Jun weaken from hunger, Kim risks sending food across the gap between buildings. After several failed attempts, June uses a drone to establish a rope line between them, turning distance into cooperation. Their partnership nearly ends when a zombie grabs the rope and begins climbing toward Kim's apartment. Jun desperately distracts it with his drone while she regains consciousness and fights it off herself. The danger only strengthens their bond. Eventually, Jun risks leaving his apartment for supplies, sneaking through neighboring units and narrowly escaping death again. With walkie-talkies recovered from his search, the two finally hear each other's voices. Conversations replace silence, awkward jokes, shared fears, fragments of normal life returning amid ruin. Hope grows bold enough to inspire a plan. Kim believes another building nearby might be clear of infected activity. Staying hidden forever isn't survival, it's waiting to die. Armed with improvised weapons and courage born from desperation, they descend into the streets together, fighting through chaos to reach the structure. Inside, safety seems within reach, until they encounter another survivor named Shung. He offers food, water, and news of an incoming rescue operation. Relief washes over Jun and Kim too quickly. The food is drugged. When Jun awakens, the truth reveals itself in horror. Shang is chained an infected woman inside another room, his wife. Unable to accept her death, he's been feeding her living victims to keep her moving. Kim has been chosen as the next sacrifice. Jun intervenes, confronting the man as desperation and madness collide. In the chaos that follows, Shang ultimately allows himself to be consumed by the very monster he tried to preserve. Kim ends the nightmare with a gunshot, but the noise summons every zombie nearby. The building erupts with approaching footsteps. With no other choice, Jun and Kim race toward the rooftop, battling through corridors as helicopters suddenly appear overhead. Smoke signals rise into the sky while infected creatures flood upward behind them. For a heartbreaking moment, the aircraft seems to leave without noticing them. Then, just as the last bullets run dry and escape feels impossible, the helicopter returns. Soldiers open fire, clearing the rooftop and pulling the exhausted survivors aboard. As the aircraft lifts away, the devastation of the city spreads beneath them. Silent streets, abandoned buildings, a world forever changed. Over the radio, officials reveal the scale of the catastrophe. Tens of thousands infected. Civilization hanging by a thread. And ironically, the signal that saved Jun was the desperate photo he posted long ago, back when he still believed someone might come. In the end, survival didn't come from strength or luck alone, but from choosing to hold on, even when hope felt completely gone. Nasus. What would you do if one morning you woke up, checked your phone, looked outside your window, and realized the world had ended overnight? No warning, no escape. And worst of all, no one answering your messages. Today we're diving into Eli Vive, a zombie survival film that feels terrifyingly real, not because of massive explosions or armies fighting monsters, but because it traps us in the one place we all feel safe, home. Most zombie movies show chaos on highways, crowded cities collapsing, or groups fighting to survive together. But Live asks a much more uncomfortable question: what happens when you're completely alone? One apartment, limited food, failing internet, and something deadly waiting just outside your door. This movie turns modern life itself into a survival challenge. A young man who depends on gaming, social media, and online connection suddenly loses access to the world, forcing him to confront isolation in its rawest form. And that's what makes You Alive different. It's not just about zombies. It's about loneliness, mental survival, and the desperate human need to know that someone, anyone, is still out there. In this video, we're going to break down everything: the story, hidden meanings, shocking details you probably missed, and why this film became one of the most relatable survival thrillers of recent years. So stay with me, because this outbreak story hits much closer to reality than you might expect. Before we dive deeper into the chaos and survival elements of Eli Vive, let's quickly understand what kind of movie this really is. Because on the surface, it looks like a typical zombie film, but it's actually much more personal. Alive was released in 2020, directed by Cho Il-hung, and interestingly, it arrived at a time when audiences around the world were already experiencing isolation and lockdowns. That timing made the movie feel almost disturbingly realistic. The film blends multiple genres together. Yes, it's a zombie horror, but it also works as a survival thriller and even a psychological drama. Instead of focusing on global destruction, the story narrows everything down to one ordinary location, a modern apartment complex in Seoul, South Korea. And that setting is important. There are no long road trips, no safe zones revealed early, and no heroic soldiers saving the day from the beginning. The entire nightmare unfolds within the walls of a residential building, a place meant for comfort and routine. The story follows Oh Jun-woo, a young man living alone while his family is away. His normal day, gaming, eating, scrolling online, suddenly turns into a fight for survival when a mysterious infection spreads across the city at terrifying speed. People outside begin behaving violently. Communication networks start collapsing, and within hours, stepping outside becomes almost impossible. Cut off from the world, trapped inside his apartment, and running out of resources, Junwoo faces a simple but terrifying question: how long can someone survive when help may never come? And this grounded premise is exactly what makes E Alive so gripping, because it feels like something that could happen to anyone, anywhere. Now here's where E Alive becomes more than just another zombie movie. At first glance, you might expect non-stop action, chase scenes, and brutal survival battles. But this film takes a very different approach. It blends survival horror with something much deeper: psychological isolation. Yes, the zombies are dangerous, but the real struggle in this movie happens inside the human mind. The film explores several powerful themes that quietly drive the entire story. First is isolation. In a world where people live surrounded by thousands of others, the movie shows how quickly someone can become completely alone. Walls that once felt safe suddenly turn into cages. Then comes technology dependence. Junwoo relies on his phone, internet, and social media to understand what's happening. But when connections start failing, panic sets in. The movie subtly asks a chilling question: if technology disappears, are we truly prepared to survive? Another major theme is mental survival. Hunger and danger are obvious threats, but loneliness slowly becomes just as deadly. The film realistically shows fear, hopelessness, and the emotional breakdown that can happen when human contact disappears. Emotionally, the tone moves through waves: tension, anxiety, silence, desperation, and eventually, hope. And that's important, because ELIV isn't designed only for hardcore horror fans. It speaks to anyone who has ever felt isolated, disconnected, or uncertain about the future. This movie doesn't just scare you with monsters outside the door. It makes you feel what it's like when the world stops responding back. The story of UALI begins like any ordinary day. Jun Woo is home alone, casually gaming, eating snacks, and scrolling through social media, completely unaware that his normal life is about to disappear within hours. Suddenly, emergency alerts start flashing across screens. News broadcasts become chaotic. Outside his apartment window, people begin attacking each other violently. Confusion quickly turns into horror as a mysterious infection spreads across the city at terrifying speed. Within a single day, society collapses. Panicked residents try to escape the building, but many never make it. Junwoo barely manages to lock himself inside his apartment, realizing too late that stepping outside now means certain death. At first, survival seems manageable. He rations food, watches updates online, and waits for rescue. But slowly, reality sets in. Communication networks fail, supplies run low, and the silence becomes unbearable. Days turn into isolation. With no contact from family, no electricity stability, and no clear hope of rescue, Junwoo's mental state begins to crumble. The loneliness becomes just as dangerous as the infected roaming below. Just when he reaches his lowest point, something unexpected happens. Across the apartment complex, he notices movement. Another survivor, Kim Yoo-bin, living in a nearby building, signals to him from her window. For the first time since the outbreak began, Junwoo realizes he's not alone. Using creative and risky methods, the two begin communicating from a distance, sharing supplies, strategies, and most importantly, hope. But surviving inside the apartment forever is impossible. Food is running out, zombies are invading deeper into the building, and staying hidden becomes harder each day. What follows is a desperate fight to stay alive, forcing both survivors to take dangerous risks in a world where one mistake could mean instant death. Now let's talk about the ending of UA Live B, because this final moment completely changes how we understand the entire journey. After days of starvation, fear, and isolation, Junwoo and Yoo-bin realize something important. Staying inside the apartment is no longer survival. It's slow death. With supplies gone and zombies spreading throughout the building, they make a desperate decision to escape and search for any possible rescue. But the outside world is worse than they imagined. As they move through the building, danger closes in from every direction. Zombies flood the hallways, escape routes collapse, and for a moment, it feels like all hope is lost. The film intentionally pushes both characters and the audience to the edge of complete despair. Then comes the turning point. Earlier in the story, Junwoo had sent out a survivor signal using his equipment, not knowing if anyone would ever receive it. In the final moments, that decision finally pays off. Military forces arrive after detecting surviving civilians in the area. The rescue helicopter appearing overhead isn't just a dramatic ending. It represents something deeper. Throughout the movie, survival was never only about fighting zombies. It was about holding on to hope long enough for help to find you. Jun-woo survives not because he's the strongest or smartest, but because he refuses to completely give up. Symbolically, the ending shows that human connection saves them long before the helicopter does. The moment Jun-woo discovers another survivor is the real beginning of survival. And that leaves us with an important interpretation. In a collapsing world, people don't survive alone, they survive together. The ending may feel simple on the surface, but emotionally, it closes the story with a powerful message. Even in total isolation, hope can still reach you. One of the reasons SA Alive works so well is because many of its smartest ideas are hidden in small details that viewers often miss on the first watch. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward survival story, but underneath, the film is packed with symbolism about modern life. Let's start with the most important element, technology. At the beginning of the movie, Jun-woo is constantly connected, gaming online, scrolling social media, watching live streams. His phone represents comfort and normalcy. But as the outbreak spreads, notifications stop, signals disappear, and the digital world slowly goes silent. This shift quietly shows how dependent modern society has become on connection through screens. When technology fails, Jun-woo isn't just cut off from information, he's cut off from humanity itself. Another powerful symbol is the apartment complex. These towering buildings are filled with hundreds of people living only meters apart, yet everyone is isolated behind closed doors. Even before the outbreak, the environment reflects urban loneliness. After the infection spreads, those same apartments transform into vertical prisons. Safety and danger exist in the same space. The film also uses subtle visual foreshadowing. Early scenes show Jun-woo as unprepared for real-world survival, relying on convenience and routine. As time passes, small behavioral changes reveal his growth. He learns to ration food, think strategically, and adapt without dramatic transformation scenes. Even the zombies themselves carry symbolic weight. Many remain trapped in repetitive movements around the building, almost mirroring how people lived routine-driven lives before the collapse. These hidden layers make ALIV more than a horror film. It quietly reflects modern isolation, digital dependence, and how fragile everyday normal life truly is. Now let's step behind the camera, because the making of You're Alive is almost as interesting as the movie itself. One surprising fact is that the film was actually inspired by an American screenplay called Alone. The concept was later adapted into a Korean setting, which helped transform the story into something more grounded in modern urban living, especially the high-rise apartment culture seen in Seoul. Another fascinating detail is how intentionally limited the filming locations were. Most of the movie takes place inside apartments and balconies, and this wasn't just a budget decision. The filmmakers wanted viewers to feel trapped alongside the main character, creating real claustrophobia instead of relying on massive action scenes. Actor Yoo-ah-hin, who plays Jun-woo, focused heavily on portraying psychological realism. Rather than acting like a traditional action hero, he studied how an ordinary person might actually react to prolonged isolation, including panic, boredom, emotional breakdown, and moments of hopelessness. Many scenes showing loneliness were filmed with minimal crew presence to help create genuine reactions and natural performances. There's also an interesting production challenge maintaining tension in a zombie movie without constant movement. To solve this, the filmmakers used creative camera angles, window perspectives, and distance shots between buildings to keep suspense alive even when characters couldn't physically meet. And here's something viewers often don't realize. The movie gained massive global popularity, largely through streaming platforms. During worldwide lockdown periods, audiences connected deeply with its themes of being stuck indoors, which unexpectedly turned ALIV into one of the most talked-about survival films of its time. Sometimes, the right movie arrives at exactly the right moment. To really understand what makes Up special, we need to compare it with other zombie movies, because this film plays by very different rules. When people think of Korean zombie cinema, the first comparison that usually comes up is Train to Busan. That movie is fast, emotional, and constantly moving forward with intense action and large-scale chaos, but LOVIBE does the exact opposite. Instead of running from zombies across cities or trains, this story traps its characters in one location. There's no escape route, no long journey, just survival inside four walls. The tension comes from being stuck rather than being chased. If we look at international films like 28 Days Later, both movies share a psychological survival element. However, ALIV feels more personal because the threat exists just outside the window at all times. Safety and danger are separated by a single door. Compared to massive apocalypse films like World War Z, Where the focus is global disaster and large-scale solutions, EALIV shrinks the apocalypse down to an individual experience. And that's where the movie truly stands out. Most zombie films ask, how does humanity survive? Asks, how does one person survive being completely alone? What it does better than many genre rivals is realism. The main character isn't a trained fighter or survival expert, he's just an ordinary person forced to adapt. However, viewers expecting non-stop action might find it slower than traditional zombie blockbusters. The film prioritizes tension, emotion, and psychological struggle over spectacle. In many ways, A-Alive proves that sometimes the scariest apocalypse stories aren't about the size of the outbreak, but about the silence that comes after it. When A-Alive was released, something interesting happened. The movie didn't just perform well, it connected with audiences on a surprisingly personal level. Viewers around the world quickly related to its core idea, being trapped indoors, cut off from normal life, and relying on digital communication to stay connected. Because of this, many audiences felt the film reflected real emotions people were already experiencing at the time. Fans praised the movie for its realism. Instead of turning the main character into a heroic survivor, Alive BC showed fear, confusion, and vulnerability, reactions that felt honest and human. International audiences especially helped boost the film's popularity once it arrived on streaming platforms, where word of mouth spread rapidly. Critics, on the other hand, had a slightly more divided response. Many reviewers appreciated the strong performances and the tense atmosphere created within such a limited setting. They highlighted how effectively the film used isolation as its main source of horror. However, some critics argued that the story followed familiar zombie movie formulas and didn't completely reinvent the genre. And this raises an interesting question: is ELI Vive underrated, or simply a well-executed version of a familiar idea? For many viewers, the answer lies in timing. The movie arrived when themes of loneliness and survival felt incredibly real, which gave it emotional weight beyond a typical horror film. Love it or critique it. One thing is clear: Alive became one of the most talked about modern survival thrillers precisely because audiences saw a piece of their own reality reflected on screen. So after breaking down the story, themes, hidden details, and audience reactions, the big question remains: is Alive actually worth watching? The biggest strength of this film lies in its simplicity. It doesn't rely on massive action sequences or complicated world building. Instead, it focuses on something far more relatable: an ordinary person trying to survive an extraordinary situation. The movie succeeds because it feels real. The fear feels real. The loneliness feels real. And the struggle to hold on to hope becomes the emotional core that keeps viewers invested from beginning to end. The performances, especially from the lead characters, carry the film strongly, making even quiet moments tense and engaging. But it's not perfect. If you're expecting non-stop zombie action or large-scale apocalypse battles, the slower pace and confined setting might feel limited. The story stays intimate, sometimes choosing emotional tension over explosive excitement. However, for viewers who enjoy character-driven survival stories, psychological thrillers, or grounded zombie films, Nambi Samambi's a surprisingly powerful experience. This is a movie best suited for people who enjoy realistic survival scenarios, fans of modern Korean thrillers, and anyone curious about a zombie story that feels uncomfortably close to reality. Final verdict? Alive proves that survival isn't always about fighting monsters. Sometimes it's about enduring isolation long enough to find hope again. And that alone makes it a film worth watching. Reviews. I genuinely found Alive to be a refreshing surprise, mainly because it doesn't follow the familiar path most zombie films tend to take. Instead of relying purely on chaos and spectacle, it quietly mirrors fears that felt incredibly real during recent global events. One moment in particular stands out: the protagonist nervously scanning the streets below before checking his remaining food supplies, a scene that echoes an experience many people unexpectedly related to. The performances feel natural, the cinematography keeps everything intimate, and the overall tone carries a modern, unsettling energy. The horror elements land effectively without slipping into exaggeration, and the story constantly shifts just enough to avoid becoming predictable. There's a heavy atmosphere of dread hanging over everything as society slowly unravels, yet the film wastes no time getting started. From the very beginning, events spiral quickly, pulling viewers straight into survival mode. Beneath the outbreaks and panic lies a quieter question: when everything collapses, who can you truly rely on? Even when surrounded by others, infected or not, survival ultimately becomes a deeply personal battle. The title itself hints at that fragile state of existence. Staying alive doesn't necessarily mean feeling connected. And just when certainty seems possible, doubt creeps in again, Can anyone really be trusted? Maybe others offer hope, or maybe they don't. The film leans far more into tension than nonstop action. Yes, there's violence and flashes of brutality, but it never pretends to be an explosive action spectacle. Instead, it imagines how disaster might realistically unfold in a densely packed city and how different personalities respond when isolation becomes unavoidable. That grounded approach gives the story an uncomfortable authenticity, especially as the main character, live streamer Oh Jun-woo, finds his digital world replaced by a nightmare he can't log out of. After devastating personal loss leaves him emotionally shattered, confinement transforms from habit into prison, pushing him toward despair just as hope seems completely extinguished. Then, at the very edge of giving up, a sudden flicker of light from across the distance changes everything. Proof that someone else may have survived. Unlike Junwoo, Kim Yoo-bin has adapted, relying on clever traps, practical thinking, and sheer determination rather than fear. Their contrast becomes one of the film's strongest elements. Survival isn't just about hiding, but learning how to confront the unknown. The situation may remind some viewers of survival stories centered on isolated gamers facing catastrophe, where technology once served as escape, but now becomes a lifeline. And as the story progresses toward its later moments, certain tonal echoes of classic zombie comedies appear, not as imitation, but as a reminder that humanity sometimes persists in unexpected ways even during collapse. What makes the experience even more striking is how easily this film could have gone unnoticed despite belonging to such a beloved genre. For fans of zombie cinema, discovering it almost feels accidental, especially during a year already dominated by another highly anticipated South Korean undead release. Surprisingly, though, this smaller and more contained story ends up delivering a more engaging and focused experience. The opening wastes no time setting chaos in motion, immediately throwing viewers into confusion and danger rather than slowly building toward it, a choice that worked remarkably well because the urgency never fades. With only a handful of speaking roles, the lead actors carry nearly the entire film on their shoulders, and they manage to maintain engagement throughout long stretches of isolation. The infected themselves reflect the early stages of an outbreak, meaning viewers won't see decayed monsters but rather frantic, unpredictable figures driven by raw aggression. Even audiences who usually dislike fast-moving zombies might find themselves surprisingly convinced here, as the energy adds to the suffocating sense of panic rather than feeling gimmicky. For longtime genre fans, the film offers enough fresh perspective to justify its place among modern zombie stories, proving that even well-worn concepts can still feel relevant when approached from a more personal angle. Interestingly, its near-simultaneous release alongside an English-language counterpart invites inevitable comparisons, yet this version stands out through its intensity and visual chaos, the infected moving with wild, almost uncontrollable momentum, bouncing through scenes with alarming unpredictability, and just as survival begins to look possible, the question quietly shifts from escaping the outbreak to something far more unsettling. What happens when safety itself might be another illusion? One of the earliest standout moments comes from the desperate neighbor who forces his way into Oh Jun-woo's apartment during the opening chaos. The transformation that follows is genuinely unsettling, his body twisting and snapping through frantic, uncontrolled motion so violently that you almost expect bones to give way under the strain. Whether joints actually survive those spasms hardly matters. The performance alone injects immediate panic into the story and sets the tone for how unpredictable the infected will be moving forward. Comparisons between this film and its closely related counterpart inevitably arise, especially since both versions became widely accessible around the same time on streaming platforms. The alternate adaptation benefits from recognizable Western casting choices, including a veteran actor portraying an aging resident struggling to protect his infected spouse, a deeply emotional subplot. Meanwhile, viewers unfamiliar with Korean cinema may initially feel disconnected from the cast here, yet that unfamiliarity quickly fades as the performances carry the emotional weight without needing star recognition. Watching both versions side by side is possible, but it soon becomes clear that one delivers a sharper sense of urgency and spectacle without requiring much debate. Despite living in a crowded urban environment packed with thousands of people, Junwoo's life before the outbreak already feels isolated. His interactions exist mostly through screens, gaming sessions, messages, and social feeds replacing real-world relationships. When the infection spreads and communication networks collapse, that digital comfort disappears overnight, forcing him to confront a silence far more terrifying than the creatures outside. Days blur together, supplies shrink, and loneliness slowly erodes his mental stability. Just as despair threatens to completely consume him, another survivor reveals herself from across the building, Kim Yoo-bin, whose resourcefulness contrasts sharply with his earlier passivity. Through improvised signals and shared determination, the two begin forming a fragile connection strong enough to keep them going, at least until remaining hidden is no longer an option. At first glance, the hashtag in the title might suggest a story overly dependent on trends or technology destined to feel dated. Surprisingly, the film avoids that trap. Smartphones, drones, and online culture appear naturally within the narrative, but they never overshadow the central theme, the human need for connection when survival becomes uncertain. Beneath the outbreaks and suspense lies an unexpectedly warm emotional core, balancing moments of anxiety with glimpses of hope. The pacing reflects this duality as well, alternating between quiet routines of isolation and sudden bursts of danger that prevent the story from stagnating. Director Il Cho structures the opening with remarkable efficiency, plunging viewers directly into catastrophe. News broadcasts, frantic street footage, and escalating attacks unfold almost immediately, creating an overwhelming sense that events spiral beyond control before anyone fully understands what's happening. The infected establish themselves early as a relentless threat, their aggression shaping later sequences where survival depends on quick thinking and risky maneuvering. Scenes of helpless witnesses trapped behind windows or survivors barely escaping attacks reinforce the tension, especially once both apartment dwellers must defend their spaces from relentless intrusions. As the narrative advances, the action intensifies, building toward a desperate attempt to escape confinement altogether. The later sequences, navigating corridors, dodging swarming attackers, and racing through increasingly dangerous territory, give the film a surge of momentum leading into a gripping final stretch. Combined with convincing practical effects and detailed makeup work, these moments highlight some of the production's strongest qualities. Still, the film isn't without its rough edges. Extended stretches focusing on Jun-woo alone occasionally slow the rhythm, lingering on repetitive attempts to reconnect online or documenting his isolation in ways that feel familiar to the genre. Certain behaviors emphasize his immaturity or poor decision-making, reinforcing recognizable survival story cliches rather than breaking new ground. While these quieter passages aim to illustrate psychological decline, they sometimes test patience before the story regains its urgency. And just when it seems the worst danger lies outside the apartment walls, another realization begins to surface. What if the greatest obstacle to survival isn't the infected at all, but the choices he keeps making when no one is watching? Where the film begins to stumble slightly is in its later stretch, where the narrative grows unexpectedly messy. The introduction of an additional survivor feels unnecessary, almost as if the story briefly loses confidence in its simpler, more focused survival setup. Instead of strengthening the tension between the main characters, this new presence mainly exists to trigger sudden twists that arrive quickly and disappear just as fast. The resulting chaos creates distractions rather than meaningful stakes, and the resolution tied to this subplot ends up complicating their escape in ways that feel forced rather than organic. Trimming these moments, along with some familiar bursts of heightened melodrama, could easily have tightened the pacing and strengthened the overall impact. Even with those issues, the film still earns solid appreciation within the zombie genre. For viewers who enjoy well-crafted outbreak stories, negative reactions probably shouldn't carry too much weight. Debates about whether it resembles or reworks ideas from other international films miss the point entirely. What ultimately matters is whether the experience remains engaging. On that front, the movie succeeds more often than it fails. The makeup and creature design deserve particular praise, presenting infected individuals that look disturbing without relying on excessive decay, reinforcing the sense that this catastrophe is still unfolding in real time. Comparisons to other well-known Korean zombie hits naturally come up, but treating them as direct competitors feels unnecessary. Each tells a different kind of survival story. Here, the focus stays tightly locked on just a couple of characters navigating isolation rather than large-scale spectacle. Yoo Ah-in and Park Shin-hye carry that responsibility convincingly, grounding the film emotionally even during its weaker narrative turns. Their performances help maintain investment, proving that a smaller cast can still sustain tension when the chemistry feels believable. Much of the film unfolds inside a single apartment, turning limited space into both refuge and prison. Watching supplies slowly disappear while fear builds outside creates an experience that feels strangely familiar, almost like a dramatized version of worst-case anxieties people imagine during global lockdown periods. The allegorical layer never overwhelms the story, though. It still works perfectly well as a straightforward survival thriller. Its grounded, street-level perspective separates it from larger zombie productions, even if occasional tonal inconsistencies and slower passages prevent it from becoming truly unforgettable. There are exciting highlights scattered throughout. clever communication between survivors, creative methods of sharing resources, and nerve-wracking chases through towering apartment structures that inject bursts of adrenaline exactly when needed. The relatively concise runtime also helps keep things moving, preventing the story from overstaying its welcome despite moments that briefly drag. In many ways, the film arrived at exactly the right cultural moment, unintentionally reflecting fears that audiences around the world were already experiencing. Looking back now, it almost feels like a snapshot of a specific era, a record of how technology, isolation, and uncertainty defined daily life in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Even without the accidental real-world parallels, the attempt to modernize familiar zombie tropes through gaming culture, social media, and digital dependence adds an interesting layer. Still, the film rarely pushes itself beyond being simply good. It remains competent, watchable, and occasionally gripping, yet hesitant to reach for something truly exceptional, which can leave genre fans wanting just a little more. And as Jun-woo watches his remaining supplies vanish, food nearly gone, clean water no longer guaranteed, the survival question stops being theoretical altogether, because when hunger and thirst arrive before rescue ever does, what desperate decision will he make next? As the days stretch on, Jun-woo's situation begins to take a serious psychological toll. 15 days trapped inside an apartment with dwindling food, no reliable water, and chaos raging just beyond the walls would push anyone to the edge. His isolation stops feeling like survival and starts resembling slow collapse. Grief weighs heavily on him, especially as it becomes increasingly clear that his parents likely didn't survive the outbreak. The emotional strain builds until desperation nearly drives him to end his own life, a moment that underscores just how terrifying loneliness can become when hope disappears. Fortunately, that breaking point passes, though the danger outside continues evolving in ways he never expected. The infected prove far more capable than simple mindless threats. Their ability to climb and adapt makes every supposed safe space feel temporary, turning vertical city living into another battlefield. Just when complete isolation seems inevitable, the appearance of Yu-bin changes the emotional balance of the story. Unlike Jun-woo's early helplessness, she demonstrates resilience and combat readiness, bringing energy and determination that reignite his will to survive. Their cooperation introduces moments of optimism, though the world they inhabit constantly reminds them that trust can be risky. That warning becomes painfully clear when assistance arrives from an unexpected source. The man who appears willing to help carries an unsettling presence from the start, and suspicion quickly proves justified. His disturbing plan, preserving his infected spouse while sacrificing others, adds one of the film's darker moral turns, exposing how desperation can twist humanity under extreme circumstances. It's a grim reminder that danger doesn't always come from the undead alone. When military forces finally intervene, arriving dramatically to extract survivors, the sudden rescue offers relief after prolonged tension, delivering an ending that leans toward hope rather than despair. The journey may not redefine the genre, but strong performances and a solid narrative foundation help it remain satisfying overall. Throughout much of the film, there's an underlying expectation that a major twist might be waiting just around the corner. Given South Korea's reputation for inventive genre storytelling, viewers may anticipate something radically subversive. Instead, the story largely follows through on what it promises from the beginning. The absence of a dramatic late revelation might surprise some audiences more than any twist itself. Minor inconsistencies, such as how overwhelmingly lethal the infected appear early on compared to later encounters, occasionally stand out, leaving questions about whether the outbreak behaves more like a fast-spreading contagion or traditional zombification. What makes the film distinctive, however, is its refusal to focus solely on large-scale destruction. Rather than showcasing endless waves of undead chaos, the narrative narrows its attention to personal endurance. Isolation, moral choices, and instinctive survival take center stage. Beneath the horror lies an exploration of loneliness and resilience, subtly examining how people adapt when stripped of routine human contact. Technology plays an unexpectedly positive role here, not as distraction, but as connection, information, and sometimes salvation when conventional systems fail. Technically, the production remains impressive. Atmospheric cinematography captures the suffocating emptiness of abandoned spaces, while sound design heightens tension through distant noise and sudden eruptions of violence. Yoo-ah-in and Park Shin-hye anchor the experience with believable performances that keep emotional stakes grounded even during heightened moments. The narrative occasionally slows during its middle portion, particularly when dramatic elements stretch a bit too far. Yet the final act restores momentum and pushes toward a cathartic resolution that feels earned. From its opening surge of chaos, the film maintains forward motion by constantly evolving its survival scenarios. Early sections function almost like a one-person survival diary, following Junwoo as he struggles to maintain sanity while surrounded by relentless threats. Once Yubin becomes part of the equation, the story cleverly expands its limited setting, turning two separate apartments into interconnected lifelines. Small moments, like sharing meals remotely or coordinating plans across distance, add warmth without undermining the tension. Technology threads through nearly every stage of survival. Live stream equipment, drones, phones, and improvised communication tools become extensions of human persistence rather than gimmicks. Much like classic zombie films that used horror to comment on societal habits, this story quietly reflects modern dependence on digital connection while still delivering suspense and action. The result is a zombie film that feels familiar yet timely, grounded more in human endurance than spectacle. And just when it seems the nightmare has finally reached its conclusion, one lingering thought refuses to fade. Was survival truly the end of their story, or only the beginning of something far more uncertain waiting beyond the rescue? From beginning to end, the film moves with impressive momentum. Its tightly controlled runtime works in its favor, keeping the narrative focused so there's rarely a moment where attention drifts or the pacing feels sluggish. The story wastes little energy, maintaining a steady sense of urgency that carries viewers through the experience without inviting impatience. By the time it reaches its closing moments, the journey feels complete without ever overstaying its welcome, an accomplishment many genre entries struggle to achieve. Part of what makes the film stand out is how quietly it approaches a large-scale apocalypse. Instead of overwhelming audiences with endless destruction, the story narrows its perspective to two survivors living across from one another in the middle of Seoul. This smaller focus allows unexpected emotional tones to emerge. At times, the atmosphere feels strangely peaceful, even tender, before abruptly shifting back into tension and fear whenever the outside world intrudes. That balance between calm isolation and sudden danger gives the film a distinct personality within an otherwise crowded genre. Watching it alongside memories of real-world quarantines adds another layer of resonance. Much like the characters sealing themselves indoors, audiences can easily relate to the anxiety of confinement and uncertainty. Interestingly, the film embraces a survival strategy rarely emphasized in zombie stories, hiding rather than constantly running. With the infected moving at terrifying speed, remaining unseen often becomes smarter than confrontation. Survival here revolves less around combat and more around patience, monitoring news broadcasts, rationing supplies, and adapting daily routines to an unpredictable crisis. Technology plays an especially fascinating role throughout the narrative. Nearly every attempt at connection, live streams, messages, drones, improvised communication tools, becomes both salvation and risk. The very actions meant to reach other survivors often attract danger instead. In that sense, the film quietly explores modern dependence on digital life, suggesting a world where people remain simultaneously connected and isolated. Survivors live only meters apart, yet remain separated by walls, fear, and silence, creating an unsettling contrast between physical closeness and emotional distance. Even small details reinforce these themes. Electricity lingers while other essentials fail. Televisions continue broadcasting fragments of information, and communication becomes a lifeline as much as a vulnerability. Sound itself turns into a threat, drawing attention, whether through technology or desperation, can invite catastrophe. The infected respond not to presence alone but to signals, noise, and activity, blurring the line between human connection and exposure. It creates an eerie metaphor where the pursuit of attention mirrors the very danger everyone is trying to avoid. The film's opening act remains one of its strongest sections, largely carried by Yoo-in as he navigates chaos unfolding around his apartment complex. Watching events spiral from ordinary routine into full-scale disaster provides gripping momentum, especially as shortages and survival instincts begin shaping his behavior. Once Yubin enters the story, the dynamic shifts toward cooperation, introducing familiar genre elements, shared plans, narrow rescues, and growing emotional bonds. While these developments lean into recognizable tropes, they still provide engaging moments that keep the narrative moving forward. The later action sequences maintain intensity, with swarming infected relentlessly pursuing the protagonist through tightly choreographed encounters. Even when certain plot mechanics invite scrutiny upon reflection, the immediate thrill of the chase remains effective. Viewed through the lens of its release period, the film carries an encouraging undertone. Survival often depends on endurance, adaptability, and refusing to surrender hope even when circumstances appear hopeless. Ultimately, The story offers a contemporary twist on zombie survival by grounding the apocalypse in everyday reality, a familiar individual trapped in an unfamiliar nightmare, forced to rediscover purpose when escape seems impossible. It refreshes established genre ideas by blending modern life with primal survival instincts, proving that even well-worn concepts can still feel relevant when told through a personal lens. And just when the chaos seems contained and survival finally feels within reach, one lingering uncertainty remains. After everything they endured inside those walls, what kind of world are they truly stepping back into now? One of the film's strongest advantages lies in how effectively it uses confinement as both a storytelling device and emotional pressure cooker. Much of that success comes from Hyun-wok's performance, which convincingly captures the exhaustion, fear, and creeping desperation that come with prolonged isolation. Early on, the tension feels sharp and immediate, pulling viewers into the experience almost effortlessly. Unfortunately, as the story progresses, that initial intensity begins to soften. Familiar zombie genre patterns slowly take over, and what once felt unpredictable starts moving along more expected narrative paths. By the time the final act arrives, the film struggles to introduce ideas that feel truly new, leaving the overall journey entertaining yet somewhat uneven. The premise itself remains engaging despite its simplicity. Like many apocalypse stories, the framework is easy to follow and rarely complicated, which works both for and against the film. On one hand, the clarity keeps audiences immersed without confusion. On the other, it occasionally reinforces how closely the structure resembles other entries in the genre. The two central characters are likable enough to root for, even if their personal backgrounds never receive deep exploration. Still, their chemistry helps compensate for the limited setting, as most of the narrative unfolds within a single apartment space transformed into a battlefield for survival. While the film doesn't rely heavily on traditional scares or sudden jump moments, it compensates with frequent bursts of intensity. The infected are visually unsettling and convincingly portrayed, even though much of the violence happens just outside direct view, rather than through excessive gore. The opening sequence may feel somewhat predictable, but its urgency immediately hooks attention. Interestingly, the later portion of the story regains energy through emotionally charged action and escalating danger, delivering a climax that many viewers find surprisingly satisfying. Comparisons to other modern Korean zombie films are almost unavoidable. Some audiences even suggest this smaller-scale story succeeds in areas where larger productions aimed for spectacle but lost focus. Still, while it delivers enjoyable action and appealing lead characters, it doesn't quite reach the emotional depth achieved by genre classics. The experience sometimes feels like a condensed survival version of grander zombie narratives, almost as if a massive outbreak story were compressed into the walls of a single room. Part of the film's relatability comes from how easily viewers can connect with the protagonist's confinement. Although his crisis involves an undead outbreak rather than everyday reality, the psychological effects mirror experiences many people understand: restlessness, frustration, and the mental strain often referred to as cabin fever. Moments that might initially seem irrational, impulsive decisions, or emotional outbursts begin to make sense when viewed through the lens of prolonged isolation. Survival stories frequently rely on flawed choices to push events forward, and this film openly embraces that tradition. The narrative gains renewed emotional weight once the survivor across the building intervenes at a critical moment. Their growing bond introduces warmth amid chaos, even as both characters continue making risky decisions that repeatedly place them in danger. Eventually, salvation arrives almost unexpectedly, leaning into a rescue that feels sudden yet undeniably relieving after everything they endure. For much of its runtime, the film hints at becoming something exceptional. It delivers inventive sequences, clever staging, and strong visual direction that keep the experience engaging. Even performances that initially seem understated gradually grow stronger, particularly as the lead character evolves under pressure. Though the ending may stretch believability for some viewers, the journey leading there remains energetic enough to satisfy fans of the genre. What ultimately works best is the film's efficiency. It launches quickly, avoids unnecessary exposition, and maintains momentum through well-placed action beats. The straightforward survival narrative keeps distractions to a minimum, allowing the focus to remain on endurance, adaptation, and the constant struggle to stay alive inside a collapsing world. And just when it feels like every possible escape has been attempted and every mistake has already been made, a final unsettling thought lingers. Were their survival instincts truly enough? Or did luck play a far bigger role than anyone wants to admit? When it comes to character focus, the film essentially operates as a two-person survival story, and that decision works surprisingly well. Keeping the narrative centered on just Jun-woo and Yoo-bin allows the performances to carry the emotional weight without unnecessary distractions. While the characters themselves aren't deeply layered with complex backstories, the connection audiences form with them feels strong enough to remain invested in whether they make it out alive. Sometimes simplicity serves the story better than excessive detail, and here that restraint helps maintain momentum. Where the film slightly falls short, however, is in delivering a truly unforgettable zombie set piece. There are several well-executed encounters and a few creative moments scattered throughout, yet none quite rise to the level of iconic sequences often associated with standout entries in the genre. Considering how perfectly the apartment complex setting lends itself to inventive chaos, vertical escapes, confined corridors, or large-scale building threats, it feels like an opportunity that was only partially explored. Even so, the film remains engaging because of how cleanly it embraces its straightforward concept. The strength of Olive lies in how it builds an effective narrative from an extremely simple premise. Early concerns that the story might become an overly slow psychological confinement drama quickly fade once the pacing accelerates and new interactions begin shaping the protagonist's decisions. Additional characters and evolving circumstances act less as distractions and more as catalysts pushing Jun-woo toward action rather than passive survival. The integration of modern tools, drones, messaging platforms, and online communication adds practical storytelling mechanics instead of feeling like gimmicks. What begins almost like a psychological survival thriller gradually expands into a tense horror experience layered with escalating danger. The balance between mental strain and physical threat keeps the film watchable as tension steadily increases. Both the undead outside and unpredictable human behavior inside the crisis contribute to a growing sense that safety is always temporary. Visually and technically, the production holds up impressively, with polished cinematography and sound design enhancing the unease without overwhelming the intimate scale of the story. The emotional turning point arrives once Yoo-bin enters the narrative. After witnessing devastation from isolation severe enough to push him toward hopelessness, Jun-woo finally finds purpose again through cooperation. Their partnership feels believable, forming a survival duo that audiences can easily accept. There's even an oddly uplifting energy beneath the danger, reinforced by small moments of connection that prevent the story from becoming relentlessly bleak. For viewers familiar with other apartment-bound zombie stories, parallels may naturally emerge, though this version leans more openly into visible horror. The outbreak unfolds quickly, a normal morning interrupted by alarming broadcasts describing a rapidly spreading illness that transforms ordinary citizens into violent attackers. Jun-woo's instinct to barricade himself rather than flee immediately proves crucial, shifting the narrative toward endurance rather than escape. Much of the tension comes from watching someone adapt step by step, rationing supplies, attempting communication, and confronting the psychological toll of waiting while the world collapses outside. Isolation eventually introduces unavoidable realities: dwindling food, crushing loneliness, and the growing awareness that survival might depend on another person entirely. The arrival of Yoo-bin across the building sparks cautious interaction through improvised technological methods, turning distance into connection. Instead of charging recklessly into danger like many genre protagonists, the two survivors choose patience, observing and waiting for the right moment to act. The film may not reinvent zombie storytelling or introduce radically new ideas, but it succeeds in creating genuine tension through atmosphere and character-driven survival. The infected themselves remain unsettling enough to keep stakes high, ensuring that even quieter moments carry underlying danger. And just as their fragile system of survival begins to feel stable, communication established plans forming, hope cautiously returning, an unsettling realization creeps in. What if staying hidden was never the safest choice after all? Along the way, the film even finds room for moments of humor, small human situations that briefly lighten the otherwise oppressive atmosphere. These touches help balance the tension and remind viewers that ordinary behavior doesn't simply disappear when catastrophe strikes. Near the closing stretch, the story introduces an additional narrative thread that divides opinion. Some viewers may feel it interrupts the flow, while others might appreciate how it injects variety into a story largely confined to limited spaces. The resolution itself leans slightly toward the dramatic side, perhaps pushing realism a bit further than necessary, yet it still aligns with the hopeful tone the film gradually builds. Viewed through a broader lens, the movie resonates strongly with experiences many people shared during real-world lockdowns. No undead threat existed outside our doors, of course, but long periods indoors, uncertainty about the future, and the emotional strain of separation made the story feel unexpectedly familiar. In that sense, Olive works as more than a conventional zombie thriller. It quietly reflects isolation, patience, and adaptation during crisis. Fans of smaller-scale survival stories set within confined environments will likely find this Korean take worth exploring, especially since it blends suspense with relatable emotional beats. What gives the film additional strength is how honestly it portrays psychological decline. Loss, loneliness, and despair weigh heavily on the characters, showing how easily isolation can push someone toward hopeless thoughts. The struggle for basic necessities, food running low, water becoming precious, communication fading, transforms survival into something intensely personal. Against that bleak backdrop, the need for human connection becomes just as vital as physical safety. Performances from Yoo-in and Park Shin-hye anchor these themes effectively, keeping audiences emotionally invested from beginning to end, while director Cho Il-hyung maintains a sharp, efficient pace that avoids unnecessary detours. Despite its limited scale, the film balances stress with moments of optimism. Watching the protagonist witness societal collapse from inside an apartment creates a powerful contrast between helpless observation and gradual resilience. Compared to similar isolation-driven zombie stories, this version feels more energetic and emotionally accessible, offering glimpses of warmth alongside fear. The central characters remain likable throughout, which becomes essential when much of the runtime unfolds within the same confined setting. Technology again plays a curious dual role. It offers connection and survival tools while simultaneously emphasizing how fragile modern systems truly are. The infected themselves move with unsettling, almost puppet-like unpredictability, adding visual tension even when large-scale action remains limited. Ultimately, much of the film revolves around everyday survival, improvising solutions, enduring boredom, forming relationships, with bursts of danger punctuating long stretches of waiting. As the genre continues expanding through numerous Korean productions, this film stands as another example of how familiar concepts can still be reshaped through perspective rather than scale. It doesn't attempt to become an epic spectacle. Instead, it tells a contained story about two people navigating extraordinary circumstances together. Inevitably, certain genre tropes appear toward the end, but they rarely undermine the overall experience. For many viewers, the grounded approach even feels closer to how such a disaster might realistically unfold. Of course, reactions vary. Some critics find the small setting limiting or wish for broader world building, stronger realism, or deeper exploration beyond the apartment walls. Others question performances or creature design, while some simply feel overwhelmed by the bleak emotional tone. Yet even these criticisms highlight the film's central focus, desperation, survival, and the psychological cost of isolation. And perhaps that's why zombie stories continue to draw curiosity again and again, even when audiences think they've seen it all. Something about the idea still pulls them back in, because the real question isn't why another zombie movie exists, but what this one reveals about us when the world suddenly stops feeling safe anymore. With zombie stories flooding movies and television for years now, the genre has arguably become one of the hardest spaces to innovate in. Audiences already know the basic formula. Infection spreads, chaos erupts, people run, hide, get chased, and inevitably someone turns. The real challenge isn't what happens, but how filmmakers make something familiar feel worthwhile again. That curiosity alone is enough to draw attention to Alive, and surprisingly, it manages to carve out its own identity despite operating within such predictable territory. The story centers on a young live-stream gamer suddenly trapped inside his apartment as society collapses outside his window. Instead of attempting to outdo larger-scale zombie spectacles, the film chooses restraint. In many ways, it avoids competing directly with genre giants that raised expectations sky high. Rather than chasing massive emotional manipulation or relentless spectacle, it settles into something smaller and more grounded, a survival story that knows its limits and works comfortably within them. That decision ultimately helps the film stand apart instead of feeling like an imitation of more ambitious predecessors. Another refreshing aspect is how the characters behave compared to typical apocalypse narratives. While mistakes still happen, as they inevitably must, the film avoids excessive irrational decisions purely for dramatic convenience. Acts of bravery appear, but they rarely feel exaggerated or heroic in a cinematic sense. Survival here often looks messy, hesitant, and uncertain, which makes the situation feel slightly more believable even when the premise itself remains fantastical. At the same time, not everyone connects with the execution in the same way. Some viewers see the protagonist as a reflection of modern dependence on technology, someone comfortable in a digital world, yet completely unprepared when that world shuts down. His lack of survival instincts, boredom without online distraction, and slow emotional adjustment become central traits rather than flaws the film rushes to fix. For certain audiences, this makes the pacing feel slower and the character arc less transformative than expected, especially when isolation seems like the perfect opportunity for deeper growth. Still, the infected themselves provide consistent entertainment. Visually convincing and aggressively physical, they maintain tension even when the narrative slows. Humor occasionally slips into the story as well, preventing the atmosphere from becoming relentlessly grim. Despite operating with a limited cast and confined setting, viewers often find themselves invested simply because the stakes remain personal rather than world-saving. Of course, criticism also emerges around logical inconsistencies common to survival films. Fluctuating access to electricity or communication, questionable resource management, and plot conveniences that help characters endure longer than realism might allow. For some, these issues weaken immersion, making stretches of the story feel repetitive or underdeveloped. Others struggle with modern portrayals of highly agile, almost strategic zombies, preferring the slower, traditional versions that defined earlier eras of the genre. Reactions to the protagonist himself vary widely as well. Some interpret him as an intentionally flawed representation of a digitally dependent generation suddenly forced into reality without technological safety nets. Others simply find him difficult to root for early on, though performances gradually win back engagement as circumstances intensify. Park Shin-hye's presence adds stability to the narrative, even if the script occasionally limits how much depth her character can explore. Yet despite divided opinions, one thing remains clear. The film sparks discussion precisely because it sits somewhere between innovation and familiarity. It doesn't completely reinvent zombie storytelling, nor does it collapse under repetition. Instead, it occupies an interesting middle ground, a contained survival drama shaped by modern anxieties, technology, and isolation. And just when it feels like every perspective on this outbreak has been examined, praise, criticism, expectation, disappointment. One lingering question still refuses to fade, in a world already overflowing with zombie stories. Why does this particular survival struggle stay with us longer than we expect? For some viewers, the comparison with larger Korean zombie hits creates an unavoidable sense of disappointment. When placed next to widely praised genre standouts, this smaller and more contained story can feel like the complete opposite in scale and intensity. Expectations shaped by earlier classics sometimes make its quieter approach harder to appreciate, leading a few audiences to react quite harshly. Not everyone connects with its restrained style, especially those hoping for nonstop spectacle or groundbreaking horror moments. Yet approaching the film on its own terms paints a different picture. After mixed reactions to other recent entries in the genre, stumbling upon Ally feels like discovering a simpler survival story that knows exactly what it wants to be. The premise wastes no time establishing itself. Gamer O. Jun-woo suddenly finds himself trapped inside his family's apartment while infection spreads rapidly across the city. Within minutes, chaos erupts, and the film dives straight into the outbreak without heavy exposition, a pacing choice that immediately grabs attention and keeps viewers engaged from the opening moments. That momentum largely continues throughout the film. While the narrative occasionally slows to explore isolation and mental strain, it rarely lingers long before introducing another threat or complication. The zombie encounters themselves may not redefine the genre visually, but they remain energetic and entertaining enough to sustain tension. Director Cho Il-hyung also introduces subtle ideas that help differentiate the film, particularly its decision to focus almost entirely on a single survivor rather than a large ensemble cast. This narrower perspective strengthens the theme of loneliness. Watching one individual navigate fear, uncertainty, and dwindling hope creates an intimacy many larger zombie films lack. When Yubin eventually enters the story, her presence doesn't dilute that theme, it deepens it. Instead of eliminating isolation, their connection highlights just how desperate human beings become for companionship when everything familiar disappears. The modern setting further reinforces this approach. Wi-Fi signals, live stream platforms, drones, and digital communication tools become integral parts of survival rather than decorative details. These elements ground the apocalypse in contemporary reality, making the situation feel closer to everyday life than traditional post-apocalyptic worlds. Technology becomes both advantage and vulnerability, constantly reminding viewers how dependent modern society has become on invisible networks. Performance-wise, Yoo In and Park Shin-hye convincingly portray exhaustion and desperation, carrying much of the emotional burden themselves. Still, one recurring criticism lies in characterization. Junwoo functions more as an audience surrogate than a deeply defined individual, while Yubin remains somewhat mysterious throughout. The lack of detailed backstory may be intentional, allowing viewers to project themselves into the scenario, though it can also leave emotional investment feeling slightly limited. As the film moves toward its final act, familiar genre tropes begin to surface more clearly. Certain developments follow predictable paths, and some suspenseful moments unfold exactly as expected. Even so, the conclusion manages to remain satisfying, offering closure without completely abandoning the grounded tone established earlier. Rather than attempting to reinvent zombie storytelling, the film succeeds by exploring a specific emotional angle, isolation during catastrophe, with consistency. Inevitably, comparisons arise with other apartment-bound survival stories that explore similar premises. Both approaches examine what happens when someone wakes up to find the outside world transformed overnight, and survival depends on patience rather than escape. But while those films lean heavily into psychological stillness, Not Alive injects enough movement, danger, and emotional connection to keep the experience accessible to a wider audience. And just when it seems the story has fully revealed what it wants to say about loneliness, survival, and human connection, one final thought quietly lingers. Was the real battle ever against the zombies outside, or against the fear of being completely forgotten inside those walls? Even though Alive remains an enjoyable watch, it doesn't quite reach the level of excitement its marketing might lead viewers to expect. For anyone who has recently seen other apartment-bound zombie stories, some of the surprises may feel less impactful the second time around. Still, the film earns praise for its visual presentation. The makeup work, injury effects, and overall stylistic polish give The Infected a convincing and often unsettling presence. For genre fans browsing streaming platforms, it's an easy recommendation. Just one best approached without expecting it to rival the biggest modern zombie classics. What truly elevates the experience is how strongly the story mirrors real-world isolation. The parallels to quarantine life are difficult to ignore, capturing the frustration, restlessness, and emotional exhaustion that come from being cut off from normal human interaction. Beneath the horror elements lies an unexpectedly heartfelt core, largely driven by the relationship between the two survivors. Their growing connection prevents the film from becoming overwhelmingly bleak, adding warmth to a narrative that might otherwise feel dominated by loneliness. Although the final portion leans into familiar genre territory, relying on well-worn survival tropes, the film still manages to maintain enough individuality to stand apart. Its biggest strength comes from embracing a modern perspective on the zombie outbreak. Instead of sprawling across entire countries, the chaos unfolds within the confined limits of a single apartment complex. Silence becomes just as threatening as violence, and everyday technology transforms into essential survival equipment rather than background decoration. Hyun-wok's performance grounds the story by portraying an ordinary individual rather than a traditional action hero. He reacts with confusion, fear, and hesitation, responses that feel far more believable in a sudden catastrophe. Moments of despair are balanced with flashes of determination, keeping the emotional rhythm engaging. Meanwhile, Park Shin-hye brings a calmer, more controlled energy that complements his character well, often stabilizing scenes simply through presence despite limited screen time. Interestingly, the film's strongest source of tension often comes from technical craftsmanship rather than large action sequences. Clever camera placement and sharp sound design turn simple moments, a distant noise, a knock at the door, movement just outside frame, into genuinely nerve-wracking experiences. In an era where many zombie productions chase scale and spectacle, this story feels refreshing precisely because it returns to basics: a small cast, a contained location, and a focused survival narrative. The pacing plays a major role in maintaining engagement. Events unfold steadily without dragging or rushing, allowing the situation and characters to develop naturally. The relationship between the leads grows at a believable pace, supported by a subtle musical score that enhances emotion without overwhelming it. While the film borrows familiar ideas from earlier works, it presents them confidently enough to remain consistently watchable. For longtime fans of zombie cinema, the experience also invites reflection on how much the genre has evolved. From practical effects classics that balanced horror with dark humor, to modern productions emphasizing extreme violence and spectacle, audiences have seen nearly every variation imaginable. After years of increasingly elaborate undead stories, originality has become harder to achieve, which makes discovering a quieter, character-driven entry unexpectedly appealing. And perhaps that's why stumbling across this film feels strangely fitting, because just when it seems the zombie genre has nothing new left to offer, something simple appears and makes you wonder again. Is survival horror really about the monsters outside? Or about how people endure when the noise of the world suddenly goes silent? For some viewers, stepping into Alive after years of non-stop zombie releases brings a sense of déjà vu almost immediately. The familiar ingredients are all present: A sudden outbreak with little explanation, infected crowds overwhelming cities, desperate survival tactics, and a conclusion that follows patterns audiences have seen countless times before. From that perspective, the film can feel like another entry added to an already crowded pile, especially for longtime fans who grew up with genre-defining classics and expect something radically new each time. At its core, the story plays out more like a suspense-driven survival thriller than outright horror. A young man wakes to discover the world outside his window descending into chaos as a virus spreads rapidly, forcing him to barricade himself indoors and improvise ways to stay alive. Much of the tension comes from observation rather than confrontation, watching events unfold from a distance while trying to understand what's happening without ever receiving clear answers about the outbreak's origin. That lack of explanation works for some viewers as realism, while others see it as a missed opportunity for deeper world building. Technically, the film sits in an interesting middle ground. Nothing about the production feels exceptionally groundbreaking, yet very little feels completely ineffective either. Certain moments, particularly transformation scenes or fast-paced action edits, occasionally appear uneven, while cinematography during chaotic encounters can feel disorienting rather than thrilling. Even the behavior of the infected sometimes raises questions, shifting between terrifyingly capable and oddly limited depending on what the scene requires. These inconsistencies contribute to criticism that tension often relies more on coincidence than carefully constructed suspense. Several recurring scare setups reinforce that impression. Everyday tasks suddenly interrupted by perfectly timed danger, equipment failing at the worst possible moment, or threats appearing just as hope seems within reach, happen often enough to feel formulaic. Combined with dialogue and pop culture references clearly aimed at modern audiences, some viewers interpret the film as trying too hard to appear contemporary, rather than fully developing its characters or themes. The emphasis on gaming culture, live streaming, and digital habits occasionally divides opinion, relatable to some, distracting to others. Yet even critics who find flaws often acknowledge that the premise itself remains compelling. The story unfolds almost like an accidental reflection of pandemic-era fears: isolation, empty apartments, urgent broadcasts urging people to stay inside, and the unsettling realization that ignoring warnings can have devastating consequences. Jun-woo's early choices highlight this irony. While the world changes outside, he initially remains absorbed in routine until reality literally begins pounding at his door. The arrival of the desperate neighbor marks the moment denial disappears. Information about the outbreak arrives abruptly, followed just as quickly by proof of infection spreading uncontrollably. From there, survival becomes a waiting game measured in dwindling food supplies and passing days without rescue. Hope returns only when another survivor makes contact from across the complex: Yubin, whose practicality and planning sharply contrast Jun-woo's earlier uncertainty. As their cooperation grows, the story shifts from solitary endurance toward coordinated escape. Together, they begin working toward a single objective: reaching the rooftop and signaling passing military helicopters that someone is still alive inside the silent apartment towers. Every decision now carries urgency, every movement risks drawing attention, and every step closer to rescue feels uncertain, because just as their plan finally starts coming together, one question hangs heavily in the air: will help arrive in time, or have they already made too much noise to survive the final attempt? Between Jun-woo and Yubin, and the rooftop that represents their last chance at rescue, stands one overwhelming obstacle: hundreds of infected neighbors roaming the complex, restless, hungry, and impossibly difficult to avoid. That setup alone captures what the film ultimately becomes: a straightforward zombie survival ride that may not reinvent the genre, but still delivers enough tension and entertainment to satisfy fans who simply enjoy watching people fight their way through impossible odds. There's still plenty of brutal imagery scattered throughout the story. Several encounters end in sharply executed, bone-crunching deaths that remind viewers the danger never truly fades. Much of the credit belongs to the makeup and effects teams, whose work gives the infected a disturbing physical presence. Visually, the film often looks impressive as well, using dynamic camera angles and confined framing to make even small locations feel threatening. The integration of modern technology, social media feeds, devices, and digital communication adds atmosphere during the early portions, reinforcing how connected lives suddenly become fragile when systems begin to fail. At the same time, certain weaknesses remain noticeable. The central characters, while likable and easy to follow, sometimes feel intentionally generic, almost designed so audiences can project themselves into the situation. Their developing bond introduces a light romantic undertone that doesn't fully settle into place until desperation forces emotional honesty between them. The film also leans heavily into optimism toward the end, pushing a hopeful message that doesn't completely land for everyone, despite clearly aiming for emotional uplift. Editing choices occasionally create small gaps in continuity, moments where events seem to jump forward slightly without full explanation. Even so, the experience remains enjoyable overall, surprisingly so for a streaming release many viewers might initially underestimate. Beneath the zombie chaos lies something closer to an observation of social isolation in a technology-dependent world. With much of the action confined indoors and long stretches unfolding with minimal dialogue, time itself begins to blur alongside the character's sense of reality. Day and night lose meaning, communication fades, and survival becomes an exercise in improvisation rather than strength. For much of the runtime, the film quietly explores what happens when digital comfort disappears and individuals must rediscover basic resilience. Phones lose signal, networks collapse, and the characters, once reliant on screens, are forced to reconnect through creativity and trust instead. That restrained filmmaking approach works remarkably well until the closing stretch, where the tone shifts towards something more overtly dramatic, dividing audiences on whether the payoff feels earned or overly convenient. Not everyone connects with the pacing or thematic depth. Some viewers find the atmosphere slow to build or the tension inconsistent, arguing that the story never quite reaches the intensity it promises. Others see familiar genre shortcuts or narrative conveniences that weaken immersion. Yet for many, the film succeeds simply because it remains engaging enough to hold attention, balancing suspense, character interaction, and survival drama without collapsing under its limitations. By the end, opinions vary widely, but one thing becomes clear. The film delivers a complete journey with a clear beginning, escalating struggle, and a resolution that ties its survival arc together. Performances remain solid, particularly as Yoo-bin steps confidently into a more action-oriented role while Jun-woo evolves beyond helpless observer. Even viewers skeptical at first often find themselves unexpectedly invested as the story regains momentum after quieter middle sections, and as silence once again settles over the apartment towers, broken only by distant movement and uncertain rescue. The lingering tension refuses to disappear, because even after surviving everything inside those buildings, who can truly say the nightmare outside has actually ended? The film certainly earns points for its presentation. The cinematography often captures isolation effectively, framing empty spaces and distant danger in ways that reinforce how small the characters feel within the larger catastrophe. The lead performances also help ground the story, especially when watched in its original language, where subtle emotional beats land far more naturally than they do through dubbing. Small touches of humor appear occasionally as well, preventing the atmosphere from becoming relentlessly heavy. What makes Alive slightly different from many zombie stories is how much of the tension comes from passive survival rather than constant confrontation. Instead of nonstop escape attempts, much of the narrative shows endurance, waiting, rationing supplies, and slowly losing stability while trapped indoors for days at a time. The idea is strong, focusing on long-term survival rather than immediate chaos. However, the execution sometimes skips over crucial emotional buildup, moments that should emphasize desperation, dwindling food, loss of water, or psychological collapse. Occasionally jump forward too quickly, preventing audiences from fully feeling how dire the situation has become. Certain choices also raise questions about logic within the world itself. Apartment residents rushing outside despite clear danger, sudden outbreaks appearing everywhere at once, or infected behavior shifting depending on what the scene requires can pull viewers out of the experience. The zombies sometimes retain fragments of human behavior, yet those traits appear inconsistently, making them feel less like carefully defined threats and more like tools used to move the plot forward. These inconsistencies contribute to frustration for viewers hoping for tighter internal rules. At a deeper level, the film almost invites a larger question about its own premise. Strip away the undead entirely. Would the story still function as a tale about isolation, connection, and survival? The contrast between virtual gaming worlds and real-life danger hints at an interesting thematic direction. Defeating enemies in a game is simple, but facing real consequences changes everything. Yet the movie rarely pushes that contrast as far as it could. The scenario remains compelling, but some audiences feel it stops just short of becoming truly memorable within an ocean of similar films. Still, others find the character journey satisfying. Jun-woo begins as someone overwhelmed and ready to surrender, gradually rediscovering purpose through connection and responsibility. In contrast, Yubin starts as the stronger survivor, only to experience moments of exhaustion and doubt later on, creating an emotional balance between them. The camera work frequently emphasizes these shifts, using confined framing and quiet observation to highlight loneliness and gradual transformation. Technically, the film maintains solid pacing and momentum even when explanations remain minimal, a deliberate choice that keeps the mystery intact rather than overloading viewers with exposition. Action scenes and emotional beats generally land well, though occasional unrealistic chases or visual effects weaken immersion slightly. Some familiar genre cliches appear along the way, and certain survival opportunities, like extended resource gathering or stealth sequences, feel underexplored compared to their potential. In the end, the movie sits somewhere between innovation and familiarity, competently made, emotionally engaging at times, yet occasionally held back by character decisions and missed opportunities to raise the stakes further. It delivers tension, performances, and atmosphere strong enough to remain entertaining, even if it doesn't leave a lasting mark for every viewer. And as survival hangs on fragile decisions made behind locked doors and shattered windows, one lingering uncertainty remains. Was their greatest challenge surviving the outbreak, or understanding why they survived when so many others didn't? The film's strengths and weaknesses become especially clear once everything settles. On the positive side, the makeup and costume work stand out immediately, giving the infected a believable and unsettling appearance. Editing and direction also help maintain strong momentum, keeping tension alive even when the story itself leans on familiar territory. Much of the excitement comes from how effectively the film sustains suspense through pacing rather than scale, allowing performances and tight staging to carry scenes forward. Still, several drawbacks hold it back from reaching something truly memorable. Character decisions occasionally feel questionable, and certain genre cliches appear exactly where audiences expect them. Some chase sequences try to do too much when restraint might have worked better, and moments relying on unnecessary CGI weaken scenes that could have been more effective through sound or suggestion alone. The film clearly borrows ideas seen across many zombie stories, including familiar tropes involving grief-stricken survivors clinging to infected loved ones, which makes parts of the narrative feel less original than they might have been. Interestingly, the movie works best when it focuses on ingenuity rather than spectacle. Watching characters improvise ways to survive inside confined spaces proves far more engaging than the larger action beats. Even with its borrowed elements, the steady thrill maintained through directing, editing, and committed performances helps keep the experience comfortably above average. Unlike large-scale outbreak epics, this story leans into the feeling of being one of the few survivors left behind. Isolation, dread, hopelessness, and brief flashes of optimism define the tone more than outright horror. The infected behave more like victims of contagion than supernatural monsters, avoiding exaggerated abilities and keeping the threat grounded enough to remain tense without becoming absurd. Combined with solid practical effects, the result feels intimate rather than overwhelming, a smaller survival tale rather than a world-ending spectacle. In many ways, the film resembles what the earliest stage of an apocalypse might actually look like, counting remaining food, searching desperately for signs of other survivors, tracking days alone, and attempting communication through failing technology. Conversation becomes minimal, replaced by observation and waiting. The story itself can almost be reduced to a simple survival outline: isolation, connection, betrayal, escape. Yet the emotional journey gives those familiar beats enough weight to remain engaging. Of course, not everyone responds positively. Some viewers see the film as messy or overly reliant on genre formulas, delivering short-term entertainment without deeper narrative impact. Dialogue and storytelling choices occasionally limit its potential, and the ending divides opinion more than any other part. Yet even critics often acknowledge scattered moments of creativity, striking camera angles, and sequences that successfully build tension. Comparisons between international versions inevitably arise, and many viewers find this interpretation stronger thanks to more believable character actions and a greater emphasis on modern problem-solving. Technology once again plays a meaningful role. Drones, social platforms, improvised tools, reinforcing the idea that survival in a contemporary disaster would look very different from older zombie stories built purely around physical strength. Ultimately, the film succeeds as a tightly constructed genre piece, supported by strong collaboration across departments, cinematography shaping mood, production design enhancing confinement, makeup bringing authenticity to the infected, and editing maintaining urgency. It may follow a familiar survival template, but it delivers a focused, thrill-driven experience that remains easy to watch and hard to completely dismiss. And as the chaos fades into the distance and survival finally seems possible, one final uncertainty quietly remains. After enduring everything, the outbreak demanded of them? Have the survivors truly changed, or will the world simply return to normal as if none of it ever happened? The screenplay does attempt to explore the psychological weight of isolation, particularly through the periods where Jun-woo's loneliness begins affecting his judgment and emotional stability. Those quieter stretches slow the otherwise fast-moving narrative, and while they slightly interrupt the momentum, they also serve an important purpose. A character trapped alone during an apocalypse almost has to confront that mental decline. The issue isn't necessarily the idea itself, but how long the film lingers there. A more inventive way of expressing that descent might have preserved the pacing while still allowing audiences to feel the pressure building inside his mind. Even so, many viewers still experience the film as an engaging and thrilling ride that succeeds as pure entertainment. Not everyone reacts that generously, though. For some, frustration comes directly from the protagonist's behavior. Instead of the resourceful survivalist seen in older zombie classics, Jun-woo often reacts emotionally, making impulsive decisions that feel irrational under life-or-death circumstances. Moments like giving in to despair or acting recklessly divide audiences sharply. Some interpret them as realistic human weakness, while others see them as forced writing meant to trigger drama rather than arise naturally from the situation. When survival depends on clear thinking, emotional mistakes can feel less relatable and more aggravating, pulling certain viewers out of the experience entirely. Comparisons with earlier genre landmarks only intensify that reaction. Films celebrated for combining action with strong emotional storytelling set expectations incredibly high, and smaller, more contained projects inevitably struggle under that shadow. Here, the narrative confines itself largely to a single apartment complex, which demands creativity to maintain excitement. While the film delivers occasional bursts of tension and a few clever survival ideas, some audiences feel the limited setting isn't used to its full potential. Emotional investment becomes harder when character depth or environmental variation feels restricted. The dynamic between the two survivors also sparks mixed opinions. The presence of Yubin introduces companionship and hints of emotional connection, yet not everyone feels fully drawn into their relationship. Where some viewers see hope forming between two ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, others feel detached, wishing for stronger development or higher emotional stakes. Even practical survival elements, managing food, water, and exhaustion, sometimes appear inconsistently portrayed, raising questions about realism within the story's confined world. At the same time, the discussion surrounding the film highlights a broader challenge facing modern zombie storytelling: innovation. After decades of undead narratives, audiences increasingly look for bold new angles, unusual environments, unexpected character dynamics, or fresh interpretations of the threat itself. Suggestions range from radically different zombie behavior to entirely new survival scenarios, reflecting a growing desire for evolution within the genre rather than repetition. Yet despite criticism, the film continues to hold attention precisely because it sits at that intersection between familiarity and experimentation. It may not redefine zombie cinema, but it still offers moments of suspense, glimpses of emotional struggle, and a survival story shaped by modern anxieties rather than traditional heroism. And as viewers debate whether the characters failed the situation, or whether the situation exposed how ordinary people truly behave under unimaginable pressure, one final question quietly lingers. If the apocalypse arrived tomorrow, would anyone really act smarter than they did? Adapted from Matt Naylor's 2019 screenplay Alone, later reworked alongside director Cho Il-hung-young, A-Live follows video game streamer Oh Jun-woo, played by Yoo Ah-in, as his ordinary routine collapses overnight when a fast-spreading infection overwhelms Seoul. Cut off inside his apartment, he watches society unravel from behind locked doors while desperately searching for any sign that help might still exist beyond the chaos. As days pass, survival becomes increasingly uncertain. Supplies begin running low, water stops flowing, and communication networks disappear one by one, leaving him stranded in silence. Attempts to reach the outside world fail repeatedly, and isolation slowly chips away at his resolve. The only thing keeping him grounded is the memory of his family urging him to stay alive. A fragile thread of hope that becomes painfully complicated once he realizes they are likely gone. Grief pushes him toward emotional collapse, leading to one of the film's darkest moments as despair nearly convinces him there is no reason left to continue. Just before surrendering completely, however, fate intervenes. A signal from across the neighboring building reveals another survivor, Kim Yoo-bin, portrayed by Park Shin-hye, proving that he is not as alone as he believed. Their connection transforms survival from a solitary struggle into a shared mission. Through improvised communication, cooperation, and mutual encouragement, the two begin supporting each other against both the infected outside and the psychological weight pressing in from within. What ultimately stands out most is their growing companionship amid destruction. Small gestures of reassurance and determination give emotional warmth to an otherwise bleak scenario, turning moments of vulnerability into the film's strongest highlights. While familiar genre tropes and predictable story beats occasionally surface, the sincerity of the performances helps maintain engagement throughout. Hyun, in particular, fully commits to portraying Junwoo's emotional descent and gradual recovery, making his performance one of the film's most compelling elements, especially for viewers already familiar with his earlier acclaimed work. In the end, Olive may not radically redefine zombie storytelling, but it succeeds through character connection, atmosphere, and the simple idea that survival often depends less on strength and more on human connection. For fans of the genre, or anyone interested in exploring more of Yuan's performances, the film remains a worthwhile experience that balances tension with unexpected emotional sincerity. And when the noise finally fades and survival feels within reach, the story leaves us with one lingering realization. Sometimes staying alive isn't about defeating the apocalypse. It's about finding a reason to keep going when everything else is already lost.